If you don't shoot them down, particularly when Russia has demonstrated its willingness to go to war, you do not send a strong message, and Russia has very successfully put NATO on the back foot. I understand the nervousness from some of our politicians. They say it's escalating if you shoot them down. I say it's not. Russia knows what the rules are. If it breaks the rules, you need to be very robust. Otherwise, we're in a boxing ring and we're holding our hands behind our back as Vladimir Putin starts to punch us. I don't think that's reasonable at all.
Meanwhile, Kremlin threatens a full-scale war against NATO if NATO decides to shut down Russia's aircraft. Don't you think that Kremlin just continues to bluff, to continues his bluffing strategy against NATO?
I agree entirely, and I refer back to as a military advisor, if I was advising Putin and looking at the invasion of Ukraine, your biggest strategic risk is if NATO decides to get involved, because NATO has an order of magnitude more capability than Russia does. Russia has struggled against Ukraine, which had older Soviet equipment, but has only prevailed because of the bravery, the courage, the sacrifice of your brave soldiers. Last thing Russia wants to do is to get NATO involved. So by threatening it, whether it's nuclear or whether it's if you get involved, but we've seen no evidence whatsoever that Russia would have any benefit in getting involved militarily. What you have to conclude is that Putin's approach so far has been effective at scaring NATO, has been effective at scaring European countries, and that's not healthy because Putin will continue to test NATO until we start standing up to him robustly.
How far we are to a no-fly zone over Ukraine? Do you feel that this is just discussions in Western capitals or a serious plan to also to help Ukraine to have upper hand during negotiations with the Russian side?
The no-fly zone, I think you and I have talked about that before. It sounds simple. The key to a no-fly zone is the rules of engagement, because if a Russian aircraft stays outside the no-fly zone, but uses its radar to light up a NATO aircraft in the no-fly zone and then fires a missile, what do you do? And also, if a surface-to-air missile system based in Russia fires a missile at a NATO, do you fire back? Because if you fire back at a missile system in Russia, you kill Russian soldiers on Russian territory. So there are lots of rules of engagement that need to be thought through before you put one in place. I don't think we're going to see a no-fly zone tomorrow, but what I do think is that for some time, NATO leaders were uncomfortable with the idea of a no-fly zone. Now that Putin has launched drones into NATO countries, if NATO believes that Putin cannot be trusted with his own weapons, then you now have the opportunity to justify why you have to impose a no-fly zone over part of the country just to protect NATO. And that is not a provocation, that's not an escalation, that's a perfectly reasonable way of protecting NATO territory.
And is NATO really ready for a war with Russia? Because during the attack on Poland, this air incursion, Polish airspace and NATO's Air Force used $2 million missiles to shut down such cheap drones. Do you feel that this sounds like a sustainable war strategy for a long-term war?
Well, I think you have to be careful here. We're making a jump. I think NATO didn't really expect Russia to launch an attack against NATO. And if it wanted to do a proper attack against NATO, it wouldn't be sending cheap drones across that are not going to do any real damage. It would have sent one of its hypersonic missiles, its Kinzhal missiles, or done a targeted strike. When they were doing reports of those drones, you could make the argument that they were a mistake. Russia is launching up to 1,000 drones a day at Ukraine, so it's less than, it's 1 to 2% of those that go wrong. When I was in the military and we were dropping weapons, up to 10% of them didn't work properly. So I think there was just possible that was a plausible reason why Putin had done that. As soon as you've got the jets on top of that as well, you go, no, this is very definitely a strategy by Putin, almost certainly just to cause NATO to worry about its own defense rather than attack.
There are many people also in Ukraine who are concerned about the NATO's resolve to defend NATO's territory. If Russia deliberately attacks NATO, will NATO be ready to retaliate in proper way, or just to conduct another so-called Article 4 discussions in Brussels?
I think this is a very topical question. NATO was formed as a response to the end of the Second World War, the response to the threat from the Soviet Union. If you didn't have NATO today, would it be invented today? I don't know. Now, it is invested, but if, for example, Russia was to bomb Estonia, would America get involved and risk a nuclear war? Now, I honestly believe it would, because the whole purpose of deterrence is that we have this unique safety alliance that focused on defense, not against attack, and it was deliberately designed to stop countries like Russia, because we have benefits of experience of 2 world wars that start small and get much bigger. How do you make sure we have collective defense? That's our strength. The problem we have at the moment is obviously the United States, that spend more money in NATO than everybody else put together, has justifiably asked questions about why all the members of NATO are not all paying their way. As a result of that, a lot of countries are now increasing their defense spending. So at the moment, I'm confident that NATO is robust. I'm confident that NATO is strong. As to the weapons you use, I think nobody believes at the moment that Russia wants to put itself in a position to confront NATO. And I think NATO is going to therefore be ready for war, but not expecting it at the moment.
If Russia continues to attack, to conduct such a so-called air incursion into NATO's airspace, what would NATO do from your perspective?
Well, there's been some very interesting conversations going on, because a lot of our political masters are nervous about shooting down Russian platforms. But the more they're told that this isn't an accident, this is a deliberate provocation, we're not talking about, with the drones, anybody being in there. You're not talking about the death of anybody. And even the fighter jets, nearly all the time, the pilots will eject out of the jets. So it's more, if you're choosing to confront NATO, you have to be prepared to take the consequences. And I think there is a growing understanding from our political masters that something else has to be done. I think the really interesting question, which is more profound, is what is Europe going to do in support of Ukraine? If we do nothing but what we've been doing, Ukraine will gradually lose. Putin will stop eventually for maybe 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, but then probably start again. If Ukraine was to fall, Europe will be threatened. And I think there's some really interesting conversations going on at the moment that say, is it enough to make Ukraine hold its place in the fight but lose slowly? Or what is it that we need to do to force President Putin to stop? The different question is, can you ever get rid of Russia out of Ukraine entirely? But that's a completely different question.
And President Trump is confident that Ukraine can retake all territories taken by the Russian side. Let's cover U.S. politics in the matter of support for Ukraine. Wall Street Journal reported that U.S. has begun to provide Ukraine with additional intelligence to help this conduct more strikes deep inside Russia to target Russia's energy grip. Don't you think that President Trump has understood that Ukraine is not losing the war, but still has some good cards?
I think President Trump is well aware that President Putin has a lot of cards, using his vernacular. What it means is that I think My own view, I keep clear of politics generally, is I think President Trump does want the war to stop. I think he does want the killing to stop. I think he thought that he could do a deal with President Putin, and I respect the fact that he seems to have had a go at doing that. The powerful message that came back was that President Putin is not interested at all with doing a deal, and therefore the question is then, how does Trump stop the war? If you accept the premise that Putin will only stop if he's achieved his objectives, which looks like it's the Zaporizhia, Luhansk, Donetsk, and Kherson region plus Crimea, that might take 2 or 3 more years to do that. The only other reason he'll stop is if he's forced to stop. And he can be forced to stop because of economic means or because of military means. At the moment, I don't see any appetite for the West to put boots on the ground and be involved militarily. But economically, going back full circle, there is a lot more that the West could do to put pressure on Vladimir Putin. And I think that's where the West is trying to look at. And certainly President Trump, he does not want to walk away from this war. He does not want to be made a fool of out of this war. But I don't think one statement on his social media changes American policy.
You just mentioned about sanctions. According to Bloomberg, G7 countries are finalizing the deal to impose additional sanctions on Russia's wartime economy. From your perspective, would it be enough to force Putin to negotiating table? And if Trump imposes his high tariff sanctions, devastating sanctions, as he just describes this, would it be enough to convince Putin that it's high time to halt this war, to at least try to save your country?
I've never been a believer that sanctions will stop the war, but I do think they will make it earlier rather than later. So if it increases the pressure on President Putin, let's be clear, President Putin knows that the role of Russian dictators doesn't often last a long time. And when it ends very abruptly. Lots of the people that control Russia, the oligarchs and the like, they have seen they can't go on holiday in Paris. They can't go on holiday in London. Their yachts have been taken. Their children can't go to private schools around the world. And this was meant to be over in 3 days, if you remember. We're now 3.5 years in, and with no end in sight, and with the Russian economy getting worse. I think the pressures are building on President Putin, and the quicker that you ramp up those pressures, the more likely it is that President Putin decides to negotiate. I think one thing, though, is that would force a much quicker negotiation. Early in the war, the Ukraine managed to take back a lot of Kharkiv quickly. That shocked Russia. There was a spring offensive planned. That didn't do very much at all. But if Ukraine was able to seize the initiative and push Russia back somewhere, I think you'd probably see President Putin keen to get to the negotiating table, because he would not want to go through all this pain at home and then risk losing that territory. That might be the way to get Putin to the table.
But would he be able to, he would like to present any kind of victory for his population to justify this high cost for this war? Don't you think that he really doesn't have a way out of this war?
It's a great question, because a lot of the West is talking about how to give an off-ramp to President Putin. Bear in mind, right at the start, you said that Putin doesn't tell the truth to his population. He will be able to say whatever, however it ends, even if he only gets half the territory he has now, that will still be painted as a victory. He will turn around and say, Sevastopol, it's historically significant. That is now ours. We no longer just have the Kursk road bridge. We also have a land bridge to Russia. And therefore, he's secured the future of Crimea. He will paint that as a victory. Remember, one of the objectives was to make Russia great again. And all of a sudden, from being a small country, it is now on the global stage. And it's also got new friendships with China, India, loads of other countries. I think Putin will paint this as a victory. The West will see it as a humiliating failure. But that's not the way the Russian people will see it.
Let's also cover our final topic, this big meeting, newsworthy meeting between U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, U.S. President Donald Trump, and many senior U.S. officials, generals, admirals. Also, U.S. has renamed Department of Defense as a Department of War. If you were U.S. four-star general sitting in this meeting, what would you feel?
I think one of the things you have to remember is that most of the generals will have been in the military for 25 to 30 years. They have watched a lot of politicians come and go. Unlike all of the other crowds that President Trump addresses, and there are people whooping and cheering and hollering and calling his name, there was silence through his speech. He even joked about it. It's very quiet here. I normally get lots of applause. President Trump went through his list of achievements like, I've solved 7 wars. The military that study war know that's not true. And so the only sound in the hall was when they clicked their heels together when their commander-in-chief came onto the stage. That was very telling, that it doesn't matter what Trump does, he can't force the generals to applaud him. He can't force the generals to say what a great person he is. The generals are responsible for the military capability of the most powerful nation in the world, and they want to make sure that whatever political person comes in, that they preserve the core of that professionalism, that courage, that sacrifice, and that's what will be absolutely the focus of those generals' minds.
And what is your assessment of these statements made by Pete Hegseth about so-called warrior ethos and this new Trump's playbook, new strategy?
Yeah, I think we might read too much into that. I think society is wondering about what we do about representation, whether it's black, white, coloured, whether it's female, whether it's minority groups. And there does seem to have been a lot of an effort to be more diverse in employment. I think the military, whilst it is important that it does have diversity, it mustn't lose sight that its primary aim is to go to fight wars. The best example I can give is you have a fire brigade. I don't care who the fireman is. If my house is on fire and I'm upstairs, the fireman needs to get up that ladder, throw me over his shoulder and get me out. I don't care if it's male, female, gay, lesbian. I don't care, but they must be good at their job. And that is true in the military as well. And I think all that Pete Hegseth was doing was giving the military license to say, choose the best person for the job. You're not there to meet targets anymore. And I think that's probably a good thing.
Thank you, Sean, for your time and for your support for Ukraine. It was really an insightful conversation, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.